Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Share where you are watching from, because today we will explore together a narrative known to few, but which should echo through the dark corridors of national memory. In the most forgotten corners of the Illinois State Archives, there is a record that has remained buried for over 200 years. A story so macabre that it defies our understanding of the limits of human nature. The year was 1821. Illinois still bore the scars of its recent admission as a state just 3 years earlier. The vast prairies of the American Midwest stretched out like an endless green sea, dotted with small communities struggling to survive on the frontiers of civilization. It was a time when the law came slowly, and justice depended more on the strength of arms than on the wisdom of the courts. In this desolate setting, in the vicinity of what we now know as Gallatin County in southernmost Illinois, a family had taken up residence. Official records from that time are scarce, but the few documents surviving in the county archives paint a disturbing picture of a bloodline that chose to live in the shadows of society. The region where they settled was known for the density of its forests and the intricate network of natural caves piercing the limestone subsoil. The rugged terrain offered perfect isolation for those who preferred to keep their secrets away from prying eyes. It was a place where echoes were lost among the trees and where screams could be confused with the howling of the night wind. The first reports about this family began to circulate among the merchants traveling through the region. These were stories whispered in dimly lit taverns, told by travelers who had unsettling encounters during their journeys. They spoke of a secluded estate hidden among the hills where smoke rose from the chimneys even on the hottest summer days. The patriarch of this lineage was described as a man of imposing stature, with eyes that seemed to hold ancestral secrets. His wife, a woman with a stern countenance, was rarely seen far from the property. Together, they had raised numerous offspring, sons and daughters, who had grown up far from the civilizing influence of local schools and churches. What made this family particularly unsettling was not only their voluntary isolation, but the strange patterns that began to emerge from the stories told by the few who had contact with them. Travelers reported excessive hospitality, followed by uncomfortable silence. Others spoke of insistent, almost desperate invitations to stay overnight. Local newspapers of the time, including the Illinois Intelligencer, occasionally published short notes about disappearances in the region. Merchants leaving Shawneetown headed north simply vanished. Their wagons were found abandoned on the roads, the horses grazing freely, but without any sign of their owners. As months turned into years, a dark pattern began to take shape. More experienced travelers began to avoid trade routes passing close to the family's estate. Tales of strange lights seen at night and disturbing sounds echoing through the hills spread like wildfire among local communities. The family's geographical isolation was not accidental. They had carefully chosen a site that offered multiple escape routes through the region's natural caves. It was as if they had built their own underground labyrinth, a dark realm where the laws of civilization did not apply. But not even the most careful isolation can forever hide the darkest secrets of human nature. And when the truth finally began to emerge, it would reveal a reality so disturbing that it would forever change how Illinois officials viewed the dangers lurking within their own borders. The first sign that something was profoundly wrong came in the fall of 1821, when a merchant named Josiah Peyton set out from Vincennes, Indiana, bound for St. Louis, Missouri. Peyton was known in the region as a meticulous man who always kept his business commitments and maintained regular correspondence with his family. His planned route would take him through the lands of southern Illinois, passing dangerously close to the mysterious family's isolated estate. 3 weeks after his scheduled departure, when Peyton was supposed to arrive in St. Louis, his wife in Vincennes began to worry. The letters he faithfully sent from each stop did not arrive. The merchants who knew his route had no news of him. It was as if Josiah Peyton had simply vanished from the face of the earth. The initial search was organized by Gallatin County authorities, led by the local sheriff, a man named William Morrison. Morrison was a veteran of the campaigns against native tribes and knew every trail and cave in the region like the back of his hand. What he found during this search would forever change his perspective on the dangers lurking in his own jurisdiction. Peyton's wagon was located 3 miles south of the family estate, abandoned in a clearing surrounded by centuries-old oak trees. The horses had been found grazing freely days earlier by local farmers, but no one had connected the dots until then. What disturbed Morrison most was not just the abandonment of the wagon, but the state it was found in. All of Peyton's goods remained intact: fine woolen fabrics, metal tools, even a small amount of silver coins he carried for emergencies. Nothing had been stolen. For Morrison, this immediately eliminated the possibility of an ordinary robbery. Bandits would not have left behind valuable goods and money. There was something more sinister at play. The tracks around the wagon told a confusing story. Morrison and his men found footprints suggesting Peyton had gotten out of the wagon voluntarily. There were no signs of a struggle or resistance. The marks on the ground indicated he had walked towards the hills, accompanied by at least 2 other people. The trail disappeared abruptly when it reached the rocky terrain of the elevations. It was during this initial investigation that Morrison had his first direct encounter with members of the mysterious family. 2 young men, clearly brothers by facial resemblance, emerged from the trees like silent shadows. They introduced themselves only by first names, without a surname, and offered help in the search for the missing merchant. What impressed Morrison was not the offer of help, but the way they made it. There was an almost theatrical quality to their concern, as if they were playing a well-rehearsed role. They asked detailed questions about Peyton, about his route, about when he was last seen. Questions that seemed to go beyond the normal curiosity of helpful neighbors. Even more disturbing was the intimate knowledge they displayed about the movements of traders in the region. They knew about other travelers who had passed through weeks earlier. They knew details about cargo and destinations that seemed impossible for people supposedly living isolated from civilization. Morrison decided to visit the family estate the next day. What he found there was a seemingly normal farm, but with details that didn't fit. The main house was larger than expected for a frontier family, built with superior quality wood. There were outbuildings and barns that seemed disproportionate to the size of the farm. The family received Morrison with excessive hospitality. The matriarch, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes, insisted he share a meal. The patriarch, a robust man with calloused hands, spoke at length about the difficulties of frontier life and how important it was for neighbors to help each other. But certain details worried Morrison. The amount of provisions stored seemed excessive for a single family. Cuts of meat were hanging in the outbuildings, in quantities suggesting much higher consumption than usual, and there was a lingering smell in the air he couldn't identify, but which caused him visceral discomfort. Throughout the conversation, Morrison noticed the family's children remained silent, watching him with a disturbing intensity. They were young people of various ages, all sharing the same cautious expression, as if waiting for some sign from their parents before speaking or moving. When Morrison finally said goodbye and left, he carried with him a sense of unease he couldn't explain. There was something fundamentally wrong with this family, something beyond the strangeness of rural isolation. It was as if he had just visited a theater where a sinister play was being staged, and he had been both an audience member and a potential next victim. In the weeks following Josiah Peyton's disappearance, Sheriff Morrison couldn't get the mysterious family out of his thoughts. There was something about the way they had answered his questions, a precision too rehearsed to be natural. He decided to investigate the available records about the property and its occupants more deeply. county files revealed fragmentary and contradictory information. The property had been acquired 5 years earlier by a man who identified himself only as H. Bean, paying in gold coins that, according to the clerk at the time, looked old and weathered. There were no birth, marriage records, or any official documentation about family members. Morrison discovered something even more intriguing in the records of other neighboring counties. Families with similar characteristics had mysteriously appeared and disappeared over the years in different parts of Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky, always following the same pattern: quiet arrival, voluntary isolation, and eventually a nightly disappearance, leaving behind only abandoned properties and neighbors with strange stories. What disturbed Morrison most was the realization that this family might be part of something bigger, a network of people connected by ties beyond blood, a shadowy brotherhood that had learned to move across the American borders like ghosts, leaving only suspicions and disappearances in their wake. His investigation took an even more sinister turn when he decided to interview other merchants who traveled through the region. A pattern began to emerge from the conversations. Several travelers reported encounters with members of the Bean family over the past 2 years. Always the same script: offers of help, insistent invitations to stay overnight, and excessive curiosity about routes and cargo. A cloth merchant named Samuel Whitmore told Morrison about a particularly disturbing encounter he had had 6 months earlier. Whitmore had been approached by 2 young men from the family while repairing a broken wheel on his wagon. They offered help and insisted he accompany them to the property for proper repairs. Whitmore described to Morrison a growing sense of discomfort during the walk to the farm. The 2 young men asked detailed questions about his route, about when he was expected at his destination, about how many people knew exactly where he was. When asked about their own lives, they answered evasively or changed the subject abruptly. What saved Whitmore was the unexpected arrival of another traveler on the main road. Hearing voices, he called out for help with his wagon, and the 2 young men from the Bean family immediately lost interest in helping Whitmore. They hastily said goodbye and disappeared among the trees with a speed Whitmore described as unnatural. Morrison began mapping reported disappearances in the region over the past 3 years. The pattern was unambiguous. At least 8 merchants had mysteriously disappeared on routes passing close to the Bean family property. All were men traveling alone, carrying valuable goods, and all had vanished without a trace other than abandoned wagons. The most disturbing revelation came when Morrison decided to investigate the natural caves of the region, accompanied by 2 trusted deputies. He began a systematic exploration of the rock formations near the Bean estate. What they found in the 3rd cave they visited would forever change the course of the investigation. Hidden deep within the cave, in several natural chambers, was unmistakable evidence of recent human occupation: remains of campfires, primitive cooking utensils, and, even more disturbing, piles of clothing and personal belongings clearly belonging to different people. Among the items, Morrison recognized a leather wallet he had seen Josiah Peaton carry. But what truly chilled the blood of Morrison and his men was the discovery of human bones, neatly cleaned and arranged in a separate chamber. These were not just 1 or 2 skeletons, but the remains of multiple individuals arranged with a precision that suggested a disturbing familiarity with the process of dismemberment. The cave had been transformed into a kind of macabre repository. Specialized tools hung from the rock walls, knives and saws showing signs of heavy use. The floor was stained with dark substances Morrison preferred not to identify. It was as if they had found an underground butcher shop operating for years within the bowels of the earth. Morrison realized he wasn't just dealing with a family of common criminals. There was organization, a methodology in everything they found. It was as if the Beans had developed an efficient system for luring, eliminating, and disposing of unsuspecting travelers. And judging by the amount of evidence, They had been perfecting this system for much longer than Morrison had initially imagined. The discovery in the cave transformed what had begun as an investigation into a single merchant's disappearance into something much broader and more terrifying. Morrison knew he was facing not just murderers, but an entire family that had chosen the darkest path of human nature as a way of life. The discovery in the cave forced Morrison to make a decision that would change his life forever. He knew he was dealing with something far beyond the capacity of his small local sheriff's posse. The scale of the crime suggested by the evidence required a coordinated and carefully planned response. Any rash move could result in the Bean family fleeing and the only chance for justice being lost. Morrison decided to seek help from state authorities in Springfield, the capital of Illinois. His journey there took 3 days of intense horseback riding, carrying with him some of the less disturbing evidence found in the cave as proof of his claims. What he didn't expect was the reaction of skepticism he would find among state officials. The Assistant Attorney General, an educated man named Jonathan Hayes, listened to Morrison's account with an expression alternating between disbelief and concern. Hayes had dealt with violent crime before, but Morrison's systematic description of the murders seemed almost impossible to believe. An entire family dedicated to murdering travelers for years undetected seemed more like a tavern tale than reality. It was only when Morrison presented the personal effects found in the cave, including Peaton's wallet and items matching other missing merchants, that Hayes began to take the allegations seriously. The physical evidence was incontrovertible. People were disappearing in the area, and their belongings were being found in places associated with the Bean family. Hayes decided to organize a joint operation involving authorities from multiple counties. The plan was to discreetly surround the Bean property and conduct a thorough search of both the house and the surrounding caves. The operation was to be led by Captain Marcus Wheeler, a veteran of military campaigns in the West who had gained a reputation for efficiency in complex situations. As preparations for the operation took shape, Morrison returned to Gallatin County with specific instructions to discreetly watch the Bean family. What he discovered during this surveillance added an even more sinister layer to the developing investigation. The Bean family was not inactive. Morrison observed an increase in visits from strangers to the property during the evening hours. People arrived on foot through forest trails, always avoiding the main roads. They were men and women of varying ages, all sharing a stealthy quality in their movements that suggested familiarity with clandestine activities. During one of these night vigils, Morrison witnessed something that confirmed his worst suspicions. He saw members of the Bean family receiving what appeared to be a lost traveler, an elderly man carrying a heavy backpack and walking with difficulty. The man was greeted with apparent hospitality, ushered into the main house with friendly gestures and words of welcome. Morrison waited all night, hiding among the trees, watching the property. The elderly man never left the house. When dawn came, there was no sign of him. His backpack was seen being carried by one of the Bean sons towards the hills where the caves were. It was as if the traveler had simply ceased to exist overnight. This direct observation of a possible crime in progress forced Morrison to accelerate his plans. He sent an urgent messenger to Springfield, reporting what he had witnessed and requesting that the operation be moved forward. The answer came quickly. Captain Wheeler and his task force would be in the region in 3 days. During those 3 days of waiting, Morrison meticulously documented every movement he could observe on the Bean property. There was a pattern of activity that suggested a well-organized operation. During the day, the family maintained a semblance of agricultural normality. But at night, the property turned into a center of stealthy activity. Morrison noted that the Beans had developed a system of signals for communication during these night operations. Specific lights in the windows, smoke of different patterns from the chimneys, even the positioning of objects in the yard seemed to carry meaning. It was as if they had created their own secret language to coordinate their macabre activities. The most disturbing finding during this surveillance was the realization that the Bean family was not acting alone. There was clearly a network of collaborators, people who brought information about solo travelers and trade routes. Morrison began to suspect that some local merchants, perhaps even officials from neighboring towns, might have been involved in the operation. By the time Captain Wheeler finally arrived with his force of 20 armed men, Morrison had compiled a detailed dossier that revealed the true extent of what they would face. It was not just a family of isolated killers, but the center of a criminal network that stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of people. Wheeler, a man of considerable military experience, immediately recognized that they were dealing with something unprecedented in the criminal history of the region. The operation he was about to command would not only be an arrest, but the dismantling of an organization that had transformed murder into a systematized and highly efficient way of life. The operation commanded by Captain Wheeler was planned with the precision of a military campaign. The 20 men were divided into 4 groups, each responsible for a potential escape route from the Bean estate. Wheeler knew he was dealing with people who knew the terrain intimately and who probably had escape plans drawn up years ago. The attack was scheduled for dawn on a Tuesday in November, when the first daylight began to filter through the morning fog that often covered the region's hills. Wheeler chose this timing because his observations indicated that the Bean family maintained less vigilance during the early morning hours after nighttime activities. Morrison was assigned to lead the group that would approach the main house, accompanied by 5 experienced men. His familiarity with the family and the layout of the property made him indispensable to the success of the operation. What none of them expected was to discover that the Beans had developed an even more sophisticated warning system than they imagined. As Morrison's men approached the main house, they were greeted by absolute silence. There was no smoke coming from the chimneys, no sound of morning activity, not even the normal noises of domestic animals. It was as if the property had been abandoned overnight. Morrison felt a chill of apprehension running down his spine. The house was empty, but it had not been abandoned in a hurry. Everything was carefully arranged, as if the occupants had left for a planned trip. The beds were made, the kitchen utensils neat and organized. Even the clothes in the closets were precisely folded. It was a meticulous evacuation, not a desperate escape. What disturbed Morrison most was the realization that they had been observed throughout the preparation of the operation. Someone had warned the Bean family about the approach of the authorities, with enough time for an organized evacuation. There was an informant among the people who knew about the operation, and this revelation cast suspicion on the very structure of the local authorities. Wheeler ordered a systematic search of all the buildings on the property. What they found in the annexes and barns confirmed their worst suspicions about the nature of the crimes committed there. There was specialized equipment for processing meat in quantities far exceeding what would be needed for a normal rural family. Knives, saws, hooks, and other instruments that had clearly been used for purposes that went beyond traditional agriculture. In the main barn, hidden under floorboards, Wheeler and his men discovered a secret compartment containing hundreds of personal effects: pocket watches, rings, wallets, identity documents, even gold teeth arranged neatly in small containers. It was like a macabre inventory of interrupted lives, a grim museum dedicated to the Beans' victims. The most shocking discovery came when they explored the house's cellar. Barrels that initially appeared to contain normal provisions revealed contents that made even Wheeler's most experienced men recoil in horror. The Beans had developed preservation methods that allowed them to store evidence of their crimes for long periods, creating a physical archive of their activities that stretched over years. Morrison found documents hidden in a false wall of the house that revealed the true extent of the Beans operation. There were correspondences with people in Kentucky, Indiana, Missouri, and even Tennessee. A network of informants who reported on merchant movements, lucrative trade routes, and identities of lone travelers carrying valuable goods. The documents also revealed that the Bean family was not an isolated case. There were references to other families operating similar methods in different regions of the American Midwest. It was as if there was a shadowy confederation of murderers who had systematized the crime in a way that defied the comprehension of the authorities of the time. One particularly disturbing letter, dated just 2 weeks earlier, mentioned plans to relocate to new territories and establish operations on the western borders. This suggested that the Beans had anticipated the discovery of their activities and had already had escape plans in place for weeks or even months. Wheeler realized that he was dealing with criminals who operated with a level of organizational sophistication rarely seen on the American frontier. They were not impulsive thugs or opportunistic killers. They were a highly organized criminal enterprise that had developed efficient methods for luring, eliminating, and profiting from the murder of innocent travelers. The search of nearby caves revealed even more disturbing evidence. In addition to the human remains already discovered by Morrison, additional chambers containing equipment to process large amounts of organic material were found. There were furnaces built into the rock, elaborate drainage systems, even areas dedicated to the storage of final products. What emerged was the portrait of an operation that had turned murder into an industry. The Beans did not kill just for money or goods, but had developed uses for every part of their victims. It was a macabre efficiency that suggested years of experience and refinement of methods. When Wheeler finally gathered all the evidence he had collected, he realized that he was documenting crimes that would go beyond the comprehension of most people of his day. The Bean family had created something that could only be described as a death factory, operating in the shadows of American civilization for years without effective detection. The discovery that the Bean family had escaped forced Wheeler to dramatically expand the scope of the operation. He sent urgent messages to authorities in Kentucky, Indiana, Missouri, and Tennessee, warning of the escape of a family of extremely dangerous criminals. Each message included detailed physical descriptions and warnings about the sophisticated methods the Beans employed to lure their victims. What Wheeler didn't expect was the response he received from the authorities in these neighboring states. Instead of surprise, many of the sheriffs and prosecutors responded with a disturbing acknowledgement. Families with similar characteristics had been suspected of criminal activity in their jurisdictions, but there was never enough evidence for legal action. It was as if the Beans were part of a moving tradition of crime that moved across American borders like an invisible plague. The sheriff of Henderson County, Kentucky, sent a particularly telling letter. He described a family that had operated in his area 3 years earlier, using methods nearly identical to those documented by Wheeler. They had suddenly disappeared after the disappearance of 2 merchants, leaving behind a property with disturbing evidence similar to that found in Illinois. Morrison began to realize that they were dealing with something much bigger than an isolated crime family. The Beans seemed to represent a tradition, possibly passed down through generations, of families who had chosen to live completely outside the confines of civilized society. They had developed a culture of their own, with their own codes, methods, and territories. Investigation of the correspondence found on the property revealed a communication network that extended far beyond what Wheeler had initially imagined. There were references to annual meetings in remote locations where different families met to exchange information, methods, and even territories of operation. It was like a shadowy confederacy with its own organizational structure. One particularly shocking document mentioned new recruits being educated in the traditional methods. This suggested that the Beans not only perpetuated their crimes through family lines, but also recruited and trained outsiders to expand their operations. It was a perverted form of education, passing on knowledge about murder and dismemberment as if they were legitimate business skills. Wheeler decided that the only way to fully understand the extent of the problem was to trace the historical movements of the suspect families. He organized a special task force dedicated to collecting information from multiple states on unexplained disappearances of travelers over the past 10 years. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its consistency. The data collected revealed that suspicious families had operated in at least 12 different locations in the last 10 years, always following similar patterns. They would quietly arrive in isolated rural areas, establish modest estates, and then begin to lure travelers to fatal destinations. When the pressure from the authorities intensified, they disappeared overnight, leaving only partial evidence of their activities. Most disturbing was the perception that each relocation seemed to be more sophisticated than the last. The Beans had learned from past experiences, refining their methods of attraction, elimination, and escape. They represented an evolved form of criminality that constantly adapted to changes in communications and policing on the American frontier. Morrison discovered references in old letters that suggested that this criminal tradition might have even older origins. There were vague mentions of methods of the old countries and ancestral traditions that suggested connections to European criminal practices that had been transplanted to America, along with other aspects of immigration. The investigation also revealed that the Beans had developed a sophisticated understanding of American geography that allowed them to choose locations of operation with strategic precision. They preferred areas where multiple jurisdictions met, creating confusion among authorities about legal responsibilities. They also chose regions with specific geological features, such as cave systems, which offered natural hiding places and escape routes. Wheeler began to suspect that the actual number of victims of the Beans and similar families might be much higher than initially estimated. If they had operated in 12 different locations in the last 10 years, and if each operation had resulted in multiple deaths, the total number of victims could be in the hundreds. It was a scale of organized crime unprecedented in American history at the time. The most disturbing realization was that the Beans had been able to operate successfully because they exploited the fundamental weaknesses of the communication and law enforcement system on the American frontier. The lack of effective communication between jurisdictions, the absence of centralized crime records, and the itinerant nature of many merchants created ideal conditions for organized predators. When Wheeler finally compiled all the data collected during the investigation, he realized that he had documented not just a series of crimes, but an entirely new form of criminality that defied all traditional methods of law enforcement. The Beans represented a dark evolution in American criminal history, an adaptation to the vast spaces and fragmented governmental structures of the frontier. The search for the fugitive Beans had morphed into something much bigger, an investigation into an entire criminal subculture that had learned to thrive in the shadows of expanding American civilization. 3 months after the Bean family escaped, Wheeler received a tip that would completely change the course of the investigation. A fur trader named Thomas Henley arrived in Springfield with a story that chilled the investigators' blood. Henley reported finding a suspicious-looking family settled on a secluded property in southwestern Missouri, near the Arkansas Territory border. The physical description of the family matched the runaway Beans exactly, but there were additional details that suggested they were no longer operating alone. Henley observed the movement of multiple families in the region, all maintaining separate properties, but clearly coordinating activities. It was as if the Beans had used their escape to reunite with other members of their criminal network. Wheeler immediately organized an expedition to Missouri, this time leading a force of 40 men and coordinating with local officials from the start. The operation would be run in conjunction with the sheriff of McDonald County, Missouri, a veteran named James Crawford, who had reported suspicious disappearances in his jurisdiction in the past 2 months. The trip to Missouri took a week through difficult terrain, but it offered Wheeler time to study the Beans' behavior patterns based on the evidence collected in Illinois. He developed a deeper understanding of how they operated, including their methods of selecting victims and their escape techniques. When the force arrived in McDonald County, Crawford greeted them with disturbing news. 2 merchants had disappeared in the region the previous week, both traveling alone on routes that passed close to the suspect properties. More alarmingly, witnesses reported seeing groups of armed men sneaking between properties during the night hours. The area where the suspect families had settled was geographically ideal for their operations. Located in a mountainous region with dense forest cover, it offered multiple escape routes through canyons and natural cave systems. It was also a point of convergence of several important trade routes, creating a steady stream of potential travelers. Wheeler decided that the direct approach that had failed in Illinois would not be effective against an expanded and warned operation. Instead, he developed an infiltration plan that would involve placing agents disguised as traders to observe suspicious activity and gather evidence before any direct action. Morrison volunteered to lead the infiltration mission, disguised as a tool dealer traveling alone. His previous experience with the Beans made him ideally qualified to recognize their methods of operation. What he discovered during 3 days of observation exceeded his darkest expectations. The families had established a truly industrial operation. Morrison counted at least 5 different properties coordinating activities, each specializing in different aspects of the criminal enterprise. One property served as an observation point to identify potential targets. Another functioned as an initial place of attraction. A third was dedicated to processing, and a fourth served as a distribution center for stolen goods. The level of organization was impressive and terrifying. They had developed sophisticated signal systems for communication between properties, established routes for moving materials, and even coordinated schedules for different activities. It was like a perverted version of a legitimate business operation with the same attention to efficiency and profitability. Morrison noted that the families had recruited local collaborators, including some seemingly reputable merchants who provided information on wealthy travelers and lucrative routes. This network of informants explained how they were able to identify valuable targets so accurately and how they anticipated the actions of the authorities. The most shocking finding was that the families had established relationships with local native communities, exchanging stolen goods for protection and information about military movements in the region. This created an additional layer of protection that made it much more difficult for U.S. authorities to operate effectively in the area. During his infiltration, Morrison directly witnessed the capture of a traveler. The process was executed with military precision: identification of the target, isolation of the victim, driving to a secure property, and efficient processing that eliminated all evidence in a matter of hours. It was a death machine operating with industrial efficiency. What disturbed Morrison most was the naturalness with which the families performed these activities. There was no hesitation, remorse, or discussion about the morality of their actions. It was clearly a way of life that had been normalized through generations, a family tradition passed down from parents to children like any other craft. Morrison also discovered that the families had developed business relationships with receivers in faraway cities, including New Orleans, St. Louis, and even Chicago. They had established routes to transport stolen goods to markets where they could be sold without suspicion. It was a truly national operation in scope. When Morrison finally returned to Wheeler's camp with his observations, they both realized that they were facing something that was far beyond their capabilities as local officials. The Missouri operation represented an evolved form of organized crime that would require federal coordination to effectively combat. Wheeler sent urgent reports to Washington detailing the discovery of an interstate criminal network that threatened the security of all trade on the American frontier. It was the first official documentation of organized crime operating on a truly national scale, a grim precursor to what America would face in decades to come. Washington's response to Wheeler's reports came 2 weeks later, bringing authorization for a coordinated military operation under the command of the United States Army. General Marcus Thompson was assigned to lead a force of 200 regular troops supported by local militias and civil authorities. It was the first time in American history that the federal government organized a specific military operation against civilian criminals. Thompson was a veteran of campaigns against native tribes and understood the importance of denying criminals their territorial advantages. His strategy involved completely encircling the operational region of the families, creating a perimeter that would make any organized escape impossible. It was a military approach applied to a law enforcement problem. While Thompson organized his force, Wheeler and Morrison continued to gather intelligence on the criminal operations. They found that the families had anticipated the possibility of a military response and were preparing defenses that included booby traps on the access trails, fortified cave positions, and plans to destroy evidence in the event of an imminent attack. The military preparation revealed the true extent of the criminal network. Intercepts of messages indicated that similar families in Tennessee, Kentucky, and even Georgia were being alerted to the federal operation. There were plans for a coordinated migration to even more remote territories, possibly beyond the borders of the United States. Thompson realized he was dealing with an organization that had learned to think strategically about long-term survival. They were not just opportunistic criminals, but a subculture that had developed military tactics to protect their way of life. It was like facing a hostile nation operating within American borders. The operation was launched on a December morning when the first snow of winter provided additional cover for troop movements. Thompson divided his force into 6 columns, each responsible for a different approach route. The goal was to capture all the families simultaneously, preventing any communication between them. What Thompson found when his troops reached the suspect properties exceeded even his darkest expectations. The families had turned their estates into makeshift fortresses with carefully constructed trenches, palisades, and firing positions. It was as if they were prepared for war, not just to resist a police operation. The first resistance came from the Beans' main estate, where family members opened fire on approaching troops using long-range rifles and intimate knowledge of the terrain. The soldiers found that they were facing adversaries who knew every tree, every rock, every depression in the terrain that could offer cover. Morrison, accompanying one of the attacking columns, immediately recognized the combat methods employed by the Beans. They fought like experienced guerrillas, using mobility and knowledge of the terrain to compensate for their numerical inferiority. It was clear that some members of the family had previous military experience. The battle stretched on for 3 days, with the crime families gradually retreating to defensive positions in the caves. Thompson realized that a traditional siege would be ineffective, as the caves offered access to groundwater and likely contained enough provisions for prolonged resistance. It was Morrison who suggested the tactic that finally forced the surrender. Using his knowledge of the caves discovered in Illinois, he identified points where the natural ventilation system could be blocked. By systematically sealing these openings, the troops were able to make the caves uninhabitable without resorting to more drastic methods. When the families finally emerged from the caves, what Thompson and his men saw shocked them deeply. They were not just the original Beans, but representatives of at least 7 different families, including children who had grown up completely within the criminal culture. It was an entire community dedicated to systematic murder. The interrogations revealed the true extent of the criminal network. The families operated on a system of territorial rotation that had existed for at least 2 decades. Each family controlled a specific region for a few years before moving to new territories, allowing previous areas to cool down before eventual return. The most disturbing finding was that the families kept detailed records of their activities. Carefully maintained ledgers documented hundreds of murders, listing victims by name, value of stolen goods, and disposal methods employed. It was like the records of a legitimate business, except that the product was human death. Thompson found that the families had developed an internal economy based on the exchange of victims, territory, and criminal expertise. Families with experience in different methods of murder and processing shared knowledge through a perverted educational system that ensured the preservation and refinement of their techniques. The most shocking aspect of the revelations was the discovery that some of the captured children had never known any other way of life. They had been brought up from birth to see the murder of strangers as normal and necessary. It was as if an entirely separate culture had evolved within American society, one that completely rejected the fundamental values of civilization. When Thompson finally compiled all the data collected during the operation, he realized that he had dismantled not only a criminal network, but an alternative society that had existed parasitically within America for decades. It was a discovery that would force a fundamental reassessment of how the federal government understood and fought organized crime. The Missouri raid marked the end of the golden age of roving crime families, but it also revealed the frightening ability of human subgroups to develop cultures completely divorced from the core moral values of the broader society. The trials that followed the capture of the crime families presented unprecedented legal challenges for the American judicial system. Federal Judge Samuel Vittman, assigned to preside over the proceedings, faced issues that no court had previously considered: how to judge people who had grown up in a culture where murder was considered a legitimate profession. Confessions obtained during interrogations revealed details that shocked even the most experienced military officers. The older members of the families talked about their activities as naturally as a farmer would discuss the harvest. To them, attracting and eliminating travelers was simply the family business, a tradition passed down through generations like any other craft. The Bean patriarch, eventually identified as Harmon Bean, revealed during his interrogation that the family had migrated from the Appalachian Mountains of Scotland more than 50 years ago. They brought with them traditions of survival that included extreme methods of obtaining resources. What had begun as a necessity during difficult times had evolved into a systematized way of life. Morrison, who was present during many of the interrogations, was disturbed by the twisted logic the criminals employed to justify their actions. They saw lone travelers as natural resources to be exploited, not unlike wild animals or forest timber. It was a complete dehumanization that allowed for unthinkable crimes. Documentation found on the properties revealed that the families had kept detailed genealogical records, tracing criminal lineages across multiple generations. There were entire families where each adult member had participated in at least a dozen murders. It was like a shadowy aristocracy based on criminal expertise rather than noble birth. General Thompson found that some of the techniques employed by the families showed influences from advanced military methods. Deeper interrogations revealed that several members of the families had served in military units during previous conflicts, bringing professional tactical knowledge to their criminal operations. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the families had developed relationships with corrupt elements within some local administrations. Sheriffs, justices of the peace, and even some military personnel had received bribes to ignore evidence or provide advanced warnings about investigations. The corruption extended far beyond the criminal families themselves. The trials revealed that the total number of victims over 2 decades probably exceeded 300 people. Each family had kept records of their activities that included not only death counts, but detailed assessments of the profits made. It was macabre accounting that treated human lives as inventory items. Judge Vittman faced the question of how to sentence children who had been raised within the criminal culture. Some were as young as 10 or 12, but they had already witnessed and even participated in activities that defied legal understanding. It was a situation that forced the judicial system to confront fundamental questions about culpability and rehabilitation. During the trials, an even more complex portrait of the criminal network emerged. The families had developed business relationships with receivers in important cities, including seemingly respectable merchants who knew exactly where the goods they bought came from. It was a chain of complicity that stretched deep into the American economy. Morrison testified extensively about his findings, but met resistance from some sectors of society who preferred not to believe the extent of the documented crimes. There was a psychological reluctance to accept that such organized barbarism had operated in the heart of civilized America for so long without adequate detection. The revelations from the trials forced fundamental changes in the way U.S. authorities approached interstate crime. New cross-jurisdictional communication protocols were established, and for the first time, federal agencies were given specific authority to investigate crimes that crossed state lines. The final sentence was execution for all adults who had directly participated in murders. It was the largest mass execution in American history up to that point, involving 23 people executed simultaneously in a coordinated operation in 3 different states. The children were placed in institutions dedicated to re-education and social reintegration. What disturbed authorities most was the perception that the captured families likely represented only a fraction of a broader criminal subculture. There was evidence of other families operating similar methods in territories not yet explored by U.S. authorities. It was as if they had discovered only the tip of a criminal iceberg. Wheeler and Morrison received federal commendations for their roles in the investigation, but both carried the psychological weight of what they had discovered for the rest of their lives. Morrison, in particular, developed a dark understanding of human capacities for evil that profoundly shaped his worldview. The operation against the Bean families marked a transformation in American law enforcement, setting precedents for coordinated federal investigations and acknowledging for the first time the existence of organized crime operating on a national scale. It was a grim acknowledgement that American civilization faced internal threats as dangerous as any external enemy. In the months following the executions, a disturbing discovery emerged from the confiscated files of the crime families. Among the documents were references to designated successors and keepers of traditions operating in even more remote territories. It was as if the captured families had anticipated their eventual destruction and taken measures to ensure the continuity of their practices. General Thompson organized a special task force dedicated to tracking down these references. What they discovered was a communication network that stretched as far as Texas, California, and the unorganized territories of the American West. Intercepted letters suggested that some families had migrated to regions where government presence was virtually non-existent. Morrison, now promoted to federal investigator, led expeditions to verify reports of suspicious activity along the American frontier. On a trip to Texas, he discovered evidence of an abandoned property that showed characteristic signs of occupation by Bean-like families. The patterns were unmistakable: specific architectural modifications, signaling systems, and proximity to important trade routes. The most unsettling aspect of these findings was the realization that crime families had developed a sophisticated understanding of American territorial expansion. They followed the moving frontier, always establishing themselves at the forefront of effective law enforcement. It was as if they parasitized the very process of civilization. During an investigation in the Oregon Territory, Morrison found even more disturbing evidence. An entire community of settlers had mysteriously disappeared, leaving behind only abandoned property and signs of hasty departure. The characteristics of the area and the patterns of abandonment were consistent with the presence of crime families operating refined methods. Thompson realized that he was dealing with a phenomenon that continually adapted to changes in American society. Crime families were not just opportunistic parasites, but organisms that evolved in response to pressure from law enforcement. Each successful operation against them resulted in more sophisticated methods of evasion and concealment. The investigation revealed that some of the runaway families had established relationships with Native American communities, offering weapons and goods in exchange for protection and information about military movements. It was a convenient alliance that offered crime families an additional layer of protection from U.S. officials. Morrison uncovered evidence that the families had begun operating in Mexican-controlled territories, establishing secure bases beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. Reports from American traders in Texas spoke of suspicious families operating freely in border regions, protected by corrupt Mexican officials. The captured documentation also revealed plans to establish permanent colonies in yet unmapped territories of the American West. The families had developed a long-term vision that included creating entire communities dedicated to their criminal practices, insulated from government interference. Thompson organized a secret conference with military and civilian officials to discuss the long-term implications of the discovery. The conclusion was that crime families posed a threat to national security that required continued vigilance and constantly evolving methods of combat. During his investigations in the West, Morrison found evidence that families had begun to recruit among desperate immigrant populations and failed settlers. It was a disturbing evolution that suggested expansion beyond traditional family lines to include anyone willing to embrace its methods. The most shocking discovery came when Morrison intercepted correspondence suggesting that some families had established business relationships with pirates operating in the Gulf of Mexico. It was an evolution into even more sophisticated forms of organized crime that combined land-based murder with maritime piracy. Thompson realized that the elimination of the Bean families in Missouri had been only the first step in a much longer struggle. Crime families represented an adaptable form of organization that learned and evolved with each confrontation. It was like facing a mythological hydra, where each severed head resulted in the growth of multiple replacements. The federal investigation turned into a permanent surveillance operation, with agents distributed throughout the U.S. territory, monitoring signs of organized criminal activity. It was the beginning of what would become a permanent feature of American law enforcement: the need for continued vigilance against evolved forms of organized crime. Morrison developed specific protocols for identifying family criminal activity based on patterns discovered during the Beans investigations. These protocols became the basis for future federal investigations and set precedents that would influence American law enforcement for decades. What emerged from the expanded investigation was a grim understanding that crime families were not a temporary aberration, but a persistent form of social organization that would always find new ways to survive and thrive on the margins of American civilization. 10 years after the executions in Missouri, Morrison received a report that confirmed his worst fears. One surviving merchant had arrived in San Francisco with a terrifying story of a coordinated attack against an entire caravan in the California territory. The descriptions of the attackers and their methods were unmistakably characteristic of the crime families he had spent a decade tracking. The survivor, a man named David Brennan, described an operation that showed significant developments in criminal methods. Instead of luring individual travelers, families had begun attacking entire groups using sophisticated military tactics. They had transformed themselves from opportunistic predators into an irregular military force. Brennan reported that the attackers demonstrated intimate knowledge of trade routes, travel schedules, and even the specific composition of the caravan. It was clear that they maintained an intelligence network that stretched for hundreds of miles, gathering information on potential targets with military precision. Morrison organized an expedition to investigate the site of the attack in California. What he found there exceeded his darkest expectations. The site showed evidence of a coordinated battle involving at least 50 well-armed and organized attackers. It was no longer an individual crime, but small-scale guerrilla warfare. The battlefield investigation revealed that the attackers had used advanced military techniques, including coordinated flanking movements and tactical use of the terrain. It was clear that some of the leaders of the crime families had acquired professional military training, possibly through service in recent conflicts. Morrison discovered that the families had established a permanent base in the mountains of California, creating a fortified community that served as a center of operations for multiple families. It was an evolution from itinerant bands to an alternative society with a military structure and its own government. The criminal community had developed its own economy based on the capture and processing of trade caravans. They operated as a land-based pirate state, controlling specific trade routes and collecting tribute through violence. It was a primitive form of extortion, organized on a territorial scale. Morrison infiltrated the region, disguised as a gold prospector, an identity that allowed him relatively free movement in the mountainous areas. What he observed during 3 weeks of surveillance revealed a criminal society that had evolved far beyond the isolated families he had fought a decade earlier. The community included not only the original crime families, but recruits from diverse ethnic and national backgrounds. There were former Mexican soldiers, displaced Native Americans, desperate European immigrants, and even some runaway former slaves. It was a confederation of marginalized people united only by the rejection of conventional society. Community leadership had developed a hierarchical structure based on criminal expertise and operational success. Members of the original families held positions of command, but the organization had become meritocratic within its own perverted standards. Morrison noted that the community had established regular business relationships with receivers in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and even Mexican cities. They operated sophisticated smuggling routes that turned stolen goods into cash through a network of corrupt middlemen. The most disturbing finding was that the community had begun systematically training children born within its borders. There were schools dedicated to teaching combat techniques, tracking, and methods of assassination. It was a formal education in criminality that guaranteed the perpetuation of their culture through generations. Morrison documented the existence of at least 200 people living permanently in the criminal community, with hundreds more operating as collaborators in surrounding territories. It was a significant population dedicated exclusively to organized criminal activities. The community had developed its own laws and justice system based on traditional criminal codes. There were internal courts that tried disputes, punished betrayals, and determined the distribution of profits. It was a parallel government operating on principles completely opposed to American civilization. Morrison realized that he was watching the evolution of a criminal culture into a full-blown alternative society. The families had transcended their origins as family bands to become the nucleus of a criminal nation dedicated to the systematic predation of expanding American society. When Morrison finally returned to report his findings, he brought evidence that the crime family problem had evolved into a national security threat that would require significant military resources to combat. It was no longer a matter of law enforcement, but of irregular warfare against a hostile society operating within American territory. The darkest realization was that the criminal community represented only one of several that probably existed in remote territories of the American West. The Bean families had been just the beginning of a phenomenon that was spreading and evolving across the American frontier like a social cancer. The final military campaign against California's criminal communities was launched in the winter of 1834, involving 2,000 regular U.S. Army soldiers, backed by militias from multiple states. It was the largest domestic military operation in American history up to that point, commanded by General Thompson himself, now promoted and tasked with definitively eliminating the threat posed by crime families. Morrison, now in his 50s and a veteran of a decade of organized crime investigations, served as lead consultant for the operation. His intimate understanding of the methods and tactics of crime families made him indispensable to the planning of a campaign that aimed not only to capture criminals, but to dismantle an entire alternative society. The ensuing battle lasted 3 months and spread over hundreds of square miles of mountainous territory. Criminal communities resisted with desperate fury, employing guerrilla tactics that included coordinated ambushes, sabotage of supply lines, and even the use of improvised explosives derived from mining equipment. When the resistance finally gave way, what Thompson and Morrison found in the ruins of the criminal communities shocked them deeply. They were not just operational bases, but entire cities dedicated to crime with their own weapons, workshops, agricultural systems, and even rudiments of industry based on the processing of stolen goods. The captured documentation revealed that the communities had established diplomatic relationships with corrupt Mexican officials, creating a quasi-independent criminal state that operated across national borders. It was an early form of international organized crime that anticipated developments that would not be seen again until the following century. The final death toll in the military campaign exceeded 500 people, including women and children who had lived their entire lives within the criminal culture. For Morrison, who had begun his career investigating the disappearance of a single merchant, seeing the scale of destruction required to eliminate what the Beans had started was deeply disturbing. Among the documents captured, Morrison found genealogical records that traced the origins of crime families to specific groups in the Appalachian Hills of Scotland. It was evidence that criminal culture had been transplanted to America as a full-fledged tradition, not spontaneously developed in the New World. The records also revealed that at least 3 other criminal communities had been established in even more remote territories, including regions of what would later become Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. The elimination of California's communities had been only a partial victory in a much larger war. Thompson realized that the campaign had demonstrated the need for permanent federal surveillance over border territories. It was impossible to allow isolated communities to develop without supervision, as some would inevitably evolve in directions that would threaten national security. Morrison spent his last years of service developing protocols for early detection of organized criminal activity in developing territories. His directives became the basis for future federal operations against organized crime and set precedents that would influence American law enforcement well into the 20th century. The history of the Bean families remained largely suppressed for decades, considered too disturbing for public documentation. It was a national shame that criminals had managed to operate on such a scale without detection for so long. The official reports were sealed and remained classified until the beginning of the 20th century. When Morrison finally retired in 1840, he carried with him the grim knowledge that he had witnessed the human capacity to create entire societies based on the predation of others. It was an understanding that profoundly shaped his perspective on human nature and the dangers inherent in civilization. The Gallatin County Archives in Illinois still preserve some of the original documents from Morrison's investigation, including maps of the caves where the first evidence was discovered. The site of the Beans' original estate remains marked only by depressions in the ground, where barns once stood that held macabre secrets. In the quiet hills of southern Illinois, where it all began with the disappearance of Josiah Peaton, nature has laid claim to the locations where crime families once operated. But echoes of their presence persist in official archives, reminding us that even at the frontiers of civilization, human beings are capable of creating forms of social organization that defy our most basic understanding of morality and humanity. The story of the Bean family stands as a grim reminder that the line between civilization and barbarism is blurrier than we would like to believe. In remote territories far from social supervision, some people will always choose the darkest path that human nature offers. And when they do so with organization and determination, they can create nightmares that echo through the generations.